You know, buying a house is supposed to be one of life's great milestones. A moment of triumph. The American dream wrapped in a mortgage and a picket fence. That's what James thought when he signed the papers for his new home. He wasn't just buying a house, he was buying freedom. A quiet life in the suburbs, far away from the chaos of city living. And the cherry on top. His new property came with a private tennis court. Not a shared community court, not some HOA-managed amenity. An actual tennis court, sitting right there in his backyard like a trophy for surviving years of apartment living. But here's the thing about dreams. Sometimes they turn into nightmares. And James? James was about to learn that his slice of suburban paradise came with strings attached. Strings held by the iron grip of the HOA. Now, for those of you blessed enough to have avoided this particular suburban institution, let me explain. HOAs, or homeowners associations, are like tiny dictatorships run by your nosiest neighbors. They enforce rules about everything from what color you can paint your house to how often you water your lawn. All in the name of maintaining property values. Of course. In reality, it's just Karen-level micromanagement on steroids. James didn't think much about the HOA when he moved in. Sure, he skimmed through the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC and RS, during closing, well, more like glanced at them, and figured as long as he didn't do anything crazy like install a roller coaster in his backyard, he'd be fine. Oh, sweet summer child. The trouble started on a sunny Saturday morning. James woke up early, laced up his sneakers, grabbed his racket, and headed out to his beloved tennis court for a solo game. But instead of an empty court waiting for him, he found a group of strangers mid-match. There they were, four middle-aged women in visors and pastel workout gear, smacking balls back and forth like they owned the place. Can I help you? James asked, trying to keep his voice polite but firm. One of the women turned to him with a smile so condescending it could have been patented. Oh, hi. We're just finishing up our doubles game. Linda from the HOA said we could use the court. James blinked. Linda said you could what? Use the court? She repeated slowly, as if explaining quantum physics to a toddler. It's part of the community amenities. James felt his blood pressure spike. No, it's not. This is my tennis court. It's on my property. Well, she said with a shrug. Linda said otherwise. Now, James wasn't one to lose his temper easily. He was more of a let's talk this out kind of guy, but this was pushing it. He marched back inside and pulled out his property deed, the one that clearly showed the tennis court was part of his lot. Armed with proof, he stormed over to Linda's house. Linda was exactly what you'd expect from an HOA president. A retired school principal with an air of self-importance and an uncanny ability to make you feel like you were in detention just by looking at you. Linda, James began, holding up his deed like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. Why are people using my tennis court without my permission? Linda didn't even flinch. Oh, that's just part of our community agreement, she said breezily. What agreement? I didn't agree to anything. It's in the CC and RS, she said with a tight smile. James flipped through his copy of the CC and RS later that day and found nothing about private property being turned into public amenities. What he did find were pages upon pages of rules about fence heights and acceptable flower species for front yards. Seriously. But nothing about tennis courts. The next weekend, James decided to test a theory. He put up a sign on his court that read, "Private property. No trespassing." Within hours, Linda was at his door with a clipboard. You can't put up that sign, she said. Why not? James asked. It violates our aesthetic guidelines. James stared at her in disbelief. Aesthetic guidelines? It's a sign. It's an unauthorized sign, Linda corrected him. At this point, James realized he wasn't dealing with logic or reason. He was dealing with HOA logic. And HOA logic doesn't care about things like deeds or common sense. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Every time James tried to assert his rights over the tennis court, Linda found some new rule or regulation to throw at him. She even started sending him formal violation notices in the mail for things like failure to maintain community harmony, whatever that means. Meanwhile, more and more neighbors started showing up on his court like it was their personal clubhouse. But here's where things get interesting. What Linda didn't know What none of them knew was that James wasn't just some random homeowner. He was an auditor for the federal government. And if there's one thing auditors are good at, it's finding discrepancies in paperwork. So while Linda was busy micromanaging everyone's lives, James started digging into the HOA's finances. And let me tell you, what he found would make even the most seasoned accountant raise an eyebrow. So James wasn't just mad, he was motivated. And when a motivated man happens to be a government auditor, well, let's just say the HOA had unknowingly picked a fight with the wrong guy. But before we get into the juicy bits of James' revenge, let's talk about Linda for a second. Linda wasn't just the HOA president. She was the HOA monarch. She ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist wrapped in pastel cardigans. She had her clipboard at all times, ready to issue violations for anything from unapproved mailbox designs to excessive bird feeders. Excessive bird feeders. Who even decides what's excessive? Linda does, apparently. And her favorite pastime? Weaponizing the CC and RS against anyone who dared to question her authority. James quickly learned that Linda was the kind of person who'd rather argue about bylaws than admit she was wrong. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was creating them. And every time James tried to push back, she'd whip out some vague clause about community standards or shared resources. It was like arguing with a human thesaurus of nonsense. But James wasn't about to roll over and let Linda and her HOA cronies turn his tennis court into their personal playground. No, sir. He started doing what he did best, digging through paperwork. Now, most people would have stopped at reading the CC and RS and calling it a day. Not James. He went full Sherlock Holmes on this HOA. He requested meeting minutes, financial statements, and even old newsletters from the HOA archives. And because HOAs are legally required to provide these documents to homeowners upon request, thank you, Texas Property Code, Linda couldn't refuse him without breaking the law. She tried to stall, of course, claimed she was too busy to gather all the documents or that some of them were misplaced. But James wasn't buying it. He sent her polite but firm emails quoting legal statutes and deadlines until she finally caved and handed over a stack of papers thicker than a phone book. And oh boy, did those papers tell a story. First off, James discovered that the HOA had been collecting special assessments from homeowners for years, basically extra fees on top of regular dues, for things like landscaping upgrades and community events. Sounds harmless enough, right? Except there was no record of how that money was actually spent. Thousands of dollars in assessments, and not a single receipt or invoice to back it up. Then there were the meeting minutes. Linda had been running HOA meetings like they were secret government briefings. No transparency, no accountability, just vague notes about budget adjustments and policy updates. And guess what? Those policy updates included things like turning private property into shared amenities without homeowner consent. Sound familiar? But here's where it gets really good. James found out that Linda had been paying herself a monthly stipend for her role as HOA president. A stipend? For what? Issuing violation notices and bossing people around? And she wasn't just paying herself. She'd also hired her nephew as the HOA's landscaping consultant and paid him an absurd amount for mowing lawns once a month. James couldn't believe his luck. It was like stumbling onto buried treasure. But instead of gold coins, he'd found evidence of corruption and incompetence wrapped in HOA bureaucracy. Now, James could have gone straight to the authorities with all this information, but where's the fun in that? He wanted Linda to feel his wrath, to understand exactly how much she'd underestimated him. So he came up with a plan so brilliantly petty it deserves its own Netflix series. First, he started attending every HOA meeting, armed with questions about finances and policies that Linda clearly didn't want to answer. He'd raise his hand at every opportunity, asking things like, "Can you explain why there's no record of last year's landscaping expenses?" Or, "Why does the budget include payments to family members?" Linda tried to shut him down by saying his questions were disruptive. But James knew his rights as a homeowner, and he wasn't going anywhere until he got answers. The other homeowners started noticing too. Murmurs of discontent spread through the room as people realized they'd been paying extra fees for years without knowing where the money was going. But James didn't stop there. Oh no, He started posting detailed summaries of his findings on the neighborhood's online forum, the same forum Linda used to post reminders about trash pickup and lawn maintenance rules. His posts were equal parts informative and scathing, complete with bullet points like $5,000 spent on community events last year. No receipts provided. HOA president receives monthly payments despite bylaws prohibiting compensation. Nephew hired as landscaping consultant. Paid $1,200 for minimal work. The forum exploded with comments from angry homeowners demanding answers from Linda and her board members. People who'd previously ignored HOA politics suddenly wanted audits and resignations. And then came phase 2 of James' plan, legal action. James filed an official complaint with the Texas Attorney General's office about financial mismanagement within the HOA, a move that sent shockwaves through the neighborhood when word got out. Linda tried to downplay it, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but everyone knew better by then. Meanwhile, James continued using his tennis court, not just for tennis but for hosting informal gatherings where neighbors could vent their frustrations about the HOA over coffee and donuts, provided by James himself. These gatherings became so popular that they started feeling like mini-revolutions against Linda's regime. By the end of Phase 2, Linda was barely holding on to her position as HOA president, and James hadn't even broken a sweat. So, here's the thing about James. He wasn't just good at uncovering shady HOA practices, he was great at it. And by the time Phase 2 of his plan had wrapped up, Linda's little HOA empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. But James wasn't done yet. Oh no, my friends. He was just getting started. Now, you'd think Linda would have learned her lesson by this point. After all, she'd been publicly called out for mismanaging funds, hiring her nephew for landscaping consulting, and paying herself a stipend that wasn't even allowed under the HOA bylaws. But Linda was nothing if not stubborn. She doubled down, insisting that everything she'd done was for the good of the community. For the good of the community, James muttered to himself one morning as he stared out at his tennis court. His private tennis court, that still had strangers using it like it was a public park. He watched as two guys in cargo shorts set up a portable speaker and started blasting 80s rock while they played doubles. One of them even had the audacity to bring a cooler full of drinks. That was it. That was the moment James decided it was time for Phase 3, Operation Overkill. First, James went back to his favorite weapon, paperwork. He filed an official cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they stop treating his tennis court as a community amenity. And because James wasn't just any homeowner but an auditor with a knack for legal jargon, that letter was airtight. He cited property laws, CC&R violations, and even threw in a few Latin phrases for good measure, because nothing says "I mean business" like quid pro quo. Linda tried to brush it off, claiming that the HOA had implied easement rights over the tennis court, a term she clearly didn't understand but had probably Googled 5 minutes before responding. James countered with another letter explaining why her argument was nonsense and attached copies of his property deed and survey map for good measure. But James didn't stop there. Oh no, he decided to make things personal, or rather public. Remember that neighborhood forum where James had been posting updates about HOA finances? Well, he decided it was time to take his tennis court battle online. He posted a detailed timeline of events, complete with photos of strangers using his court and screenshots of his correspondence with Linda. The post went viral within the neighborhood. Neighbors who hadn't cared about HOA politics suddenly had opinions about easement rights and private property laws. And then came the best part. James started charging people to use his tennis court. Yep, you heard that right. He put up a sign that said, "Private property, court rental available," and listed his rates. $50 per hour for singles matches, $75 per hour for doubles, $10 extra if you wanted to use his cooler full of drinks. It was petty genius at its finest. And guess what? People actually paid him. His neighbors were so fed up with Linda and her HOA nonsense that they willingly handed over cash just to spite her. Linda, of course, lost her mind when she found out about this new business venture. She sent James another violation notice claiming he couldn't run a business out of his home without HOA approval. a rule that didn't exist in the CC and RS but sounded official enough for her to try it anyway. James responded by sending her an invoice for unpaid rental fees from all the times HOA members had used his court without permission. It was itemized and everything. Unauthorized doubles match on March 15th, $75. Cooler usage fee on April 3rd, $10. Speaker setup fee on April 10th, $20. Linda didn't pay, obviously, but the invoice made its way onto the neighborhood forum, where it became an instant meme. At this point, James had turned himself into something of a local legend. People started showing up to HOA meetings just to watch him dismantle Linda's arguments in real time. One neighbor even brought popcorn to a meeting, and sat in the back like he was watching a live courtroom drama. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. One day, James got a call from a local news station asking if they could interview him about his HOA battle. Apparently, someone from the neighborhood had tipped them off about the whole saga, and they thought it would make for great TV. James agreed, of course, because why not? The interview aired on a Friday night during prime time, complete with dramatic music and slow-motion footage of James standing next to his tennis court holding his property deed like a trophy. Linda watched the segment and immediately called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss damage control. But by then, it was too late. The neighborhood had turned against her completely. And James? Well, let's just say he didn't have any trouble keeping people off his tennis court after that. By the time James wrapped up his TV interview, Linda was in full meltdown mode. Her HOA empire wasn't just crumbling, it was imploding. The neighborhood had turned against her, the forum was basically a digital pitchfork mob, and James? James was sitting pretty, sipping lemonade on his porch while watching the chaos unfold. Now, if you think James was satisfied with his victory, you'd be wrong. Because here's the thing about James. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to bury Linda's HOA nonsense so deep that no one would ever dare mess with him again. And honestly, who could blame him? So what did James do next? He went nuclear. First, he filed a formal complaint with the HOA's insurance provider. Yep, HOAs have insurance, usually to cover things like lawsuits or property damage. And James, being the meticulous auditor that he was, had found several instances where Linda's actions had exposed the HOA to liability. For example, turning his private tennis court into a community amenity without his consent, liability. Mismanaging funds and failing to provide proper documentation, liability. Paying her nephew for fake landscaping work, you guessed it, liability. The insurance company wasn't thrilled when they got James' complaint. They launched an investigation into the HOA's practices, which meant Linda now had real professionals digging through her mess. And let me tell you, those investigators didn't miss a thing. Meanwhile, James decided it was time to take his battle to the next level. Legal action. He hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense guy named Richard who specialized in property disputes and HOA litigation. Richard took one look at James' stack of evidence and said, "This is going to be fun." Together, they filed a lawsuit against the HOA for violating James' property rights and misusing HOA funds. The lawsuit wasn't just about getting justice. It was about sending a message. Don't mess with James. Linda tried to rally her remaining supporters in the neighborhood, but by this point, she was down to maybe 3 people, and one of them was her nephew. The rest of the homeowners were either actively rooting for James or staying quiet out of fear they'd end up on his bad side too. The lawsuit hit Linda like a freight train. She spent weeks scrambling to defend herself, but every argument she made fell apart under scrutiny. The HOA board members started resigning one by one, probably because they didn't want to be dragged down with her, and soon Linda was left standing alone in front of a judge trying to explain why she thought implied easement rights meant she could commandeer someone's private tennis court. Spoiler alert, the judge wasn't buying it. But here's where things get really good. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, James' lawyer uncovered even more dirt on Linda and the HOA. Turns out, Linda had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, like her cable bill and a subscription to some overpriced gardening magazine. She'd also been skimming money off those special assessments for years and funneling it into a secret account labeled miscellaneous. Miscellaneous. That's like labeling your cookie jar not cookies. and expecting no one to notice. When this information came out in court, Linda's face turned so red you could have roasted marshmallows on it. The judge ordered her to repay thousands of dollars in misappropriated funds and fine the HOA for violating state property laws. It was a total bloodbath. But James wasn't done yet. While all this legal drama was unfolding, he decided it was time to make his tennis court situation crystal clear once and for all. He put up a new sign, bigger and bolder than the last one, that read, "Private property. Trespassers will be charged $100 per hour to play tennis and $500 per hour to argue about it." The sign became an instant hit in the neighborhood. People started taking selfies with it and posting them online with captions like, "James is my hero," and "Linda who?" Even local businesses got in on the action. One nearby coffee shop offered free drinks to anyone who showed them a photo of themselves next to James' sign. Linda tried to argue that the sign violated HOA rules again, but at this point, no one cared what she thought, not even her nephew. By the end of Phase 4, yes, we're calling it phases now, Linda had officially resigned as HOA president for personal reasons, which everyone knew was code for, "I got wrecked by James." The remaining board members begged James to join the HOA so he could help clean up their mess. But James just laughed and said, "I think I've done enough." And honestly, he had. So Linda was out. The HOA was in shambles. And James? James was living his best life. His tennis court was finally his again. His neighbors were treating him like a local folk hero, and Linda had retreated into obscurity, presumably to spend her days glaring at her dwindling stack of gardening magazines. But here's the thing about James. He wasn't just content to win. No. James wanted to make sure the HOA and everyone else learned a lesson they'd never forget. Because if there's one thing James hated more than people trespassing on his tennis court, it was unchecked authority. And what better way to teach a lesson than by turning the entire neighborhood into a cautionary tale? First, James decided to tackle the HOA's finances. Now, technically, this wasn't his responsibility. He wasn't on the board, and he had no obligation to help clean up the mess Linda left behind. But James couldn't resist. It was like an itch he had to scratch. Plus, he figured if he didn't do it, no one else would. So, he volunteered to conduct a full audit of the HOA's books. And when I say volunteered, I mean he showed up to a meeting with a PowerPoint presentation titled, "How Not to Run an HOA," a case study, and basically shamed the remaining board members into letting him take over. What James found in those books could have been its own episode of Dateline. There were missing receipts, unexplained expenses, and entire sections of the budget that had been fudged so badly they might as well have been written in crayon. It was a financial disaster zone. For example, there was a $3,000 charge labeled Community Beautification Project that turned out to be Linda buying a custom fountain for her front yard. A fountain, and not even a nice one. It looked like something you'd find on clearance at Home Depot. Then there was the $1,200 security upgrade that turned out to be Linda installing cameras around her house and charging it to the HOA as if she were protecting Fort Knox. James documented everything, every shady transaction, every missing dollar, and presented his findings at the next HOA meeting. The room was packed. Word had gotten around that James was about to drop another bombshell, and no one wanted to miss it. He started with a slide titled, "Where Did the Money Go?" and spent the next hour walking everyone through Linda's greatest hits of financial mismanagement. By the time he got to the fountain, people were openly laughing, and not in a good way. One guy in the back muttered, "I knew that fountain looked suspicious." When James finished his presentation, there was a moment of stunned silence before someone finally said what everyone else was thinking. "Can we sue her?" James smiled and said, "Already working on it." And he wasn't kidding. He'd already consulted with his lawyer friend, Richard, about filing a civil suit against Linda to recover the misappropriated funds. The lawsuit wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about sending a message. If you abuse your power as an HOA president, you will face consequences. But James didn't stop there. With Linda out of the picture and the lawsuit underway, James turned his attention to reforming the HOA itself. He proposed new bylaws that would prevent anyone from ever pulling a Linda again. Things like term limits for board members, mandatory transparency in financial reporting, and strict rules about conflicts of interest. Looking at you, landscaping nephew. At first, some of the board members resisted. They weren't exactly thrilled about giving up their little fiefdoms, but James had come prepared. He reminded them that they were lucky not to be named as co-defendants in Linda's lawsuit, and suggested they take this opportunity to redeem themselves in the eyes of their neighbors. That did the trick. The new bylaws passed unanimously, but James wasn't done yet. Next on his list, fixing the neighborhood forum. For years, it had been little more than a digital bulletin board for Linda's passive-aggressive reminders about lawn care and trash pickup schedules. But James saw its potential as a tool for actual community engagement. He proposed turning it into an open platform where homeowners could voice their concerns, share ideas for neighborhood improvements, and hold board members accountable in real time. He even offered to moderate it himself, because if there's one thing James loved more than tennis courts and revenge, it was spreadsheets and order. The forum quickly became a hit. People started using it to organize block parties, share recommendations for local contractors, and even set up a neighborhood watch program, which James jokingly referred to as Operation Keep Your Fountain Receipts. And then came what might be my favorite part of this whole saga. James decided to host an annual HOA Transparency Day on his tennis court. The event was part celebration, part educational seminar. A chance for neighbors to come together over burgers and lemonade while learning about their rights as homeowners and how HOAs are supposed to work. Spoiler alert. Not like Linda ran hers. James even printed out copies of the new bylaws and handed them out like party favors. By the end of Transparency Day, people were calling him the best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood. One woman even suggested renaming the street after him, an idea James politely declined because he didn't want anyone thinking he'd gone full Linda. So there you have it. From private tennis court battles to full-blown HOA reform crusade, James turned what could have been just another suburban nightmare into a victory for homeowners everywhere. And honestly, if that's not living your best life in suburbia, I don't know what is. So, at this point, James had pretty much achieved suburban legend status. His tennis court was secure, the HOA was reformed, Linda was out of the picture, and probably Googling countries without extradition treaties. And the neighborhood forum had transformed into a hub of actual community engagement. But James wasn't just a hero, he was the hero. The guy who stood up to the HOA and won. And honestly, he could have stopped there. He could have retired from his crusade, kicked back with a cold drink, and enjoyed the fruits of his labor. But James wasn't built that way. See, there was still one loose end that needed tying up. Linda herself. Now, let's be clear. James didn't go looking for trouble. He wasn't some cartoon villain twirling his mustache and plotting her downfall. No, trouble came looking for him. Because as it turned out, Linda's reign of HOA terror wasn't just limited to James' neighborhood. Oh no, Linda had been involved in multiple HOAs over the years, leaving behind a trail of financial mismanagement, shady dealings, and enough CC&R violations to fill a small library. And guess who found out about it? That's right, James. It all started when James got a call from a homeowner in a neighboring community. Let's call him Bob. Bob had heard about James' battle with Linda through the grapevine, and probably through the neighborhood forum, which had become something of a suburban TMZ at this point. Bob explained that Linda used to be the president of his HOA before she moved into James' neighborhood, and she'd pulled the same stunts there. Misusing funds, making up rules on the fly, and generally acting like she was running her own personal fiefdom. James listened patiently as Bob vented about how Linda had once fined him $200 for having unauthorized holiday decorations, which turned out to be nothing more than a wreath on his door. And then Bob said something that made James sit up in his chair. You know, I always thought she was hiding something with those finances. Well, that was all James needed to hear. He asked Bob if he could get his hands on any records from his old HOA, financial statements, meeting minutes, anything that might shed some light on Linda's activities. Bob said he'd see what he could do and hung up. A few days later, an envelope arrived at James' house stuffed with documents. And let me tell you, it was like Christmas morning for an auditor. James dove into those papers with the enthusiasm of a kid unwrapping presents. And what he found? Oh, it was glorious. Turns out, Linda hadn't just been skimming money from her old HOA. She'd been bleeding it dry. There were payments to fake vendors, inflated invoices for landscaping work that never happened, and even a mysterious consulting fee paid directly to Linda herself. It was textbook embezzlement, so blatant it was almost impressive in its audacity. But here's where things got really interesting. Some of those payments were tied to federal grants that the HOA had applied for under Linda's leadership. Grants meant for things like neighborhood safety improvements and environmental initiatives. And if there's one thing you don't mess with in this country, it's federal money. James knew exactly what to do next. He contacted his old colleagues at the government auditing agency where he worked and casually mentioned what he'd found. Just a friendly heads up about some potential grant fraud involving an HOA president named Linda. His colleagues were intrigued and probably a little amused, but said they'd look into it. And look into it they did. Within weeks, federal investigators were knocking on Linda's door with questions about those grants. And let's just say her answers didn't exactly inspire confidence. The investigation quickly expanded to include her activities in multiple HOAs across the region. And before long, Linda found herself facing charges for fraud and embezzlement. Now, you'd think this would be enough to satisfy James' thirst for justice, but remember, this is James we're talking about. While the feds were busy building their case against Linda, James decided to take one final victory lap in his own neighborhood. He organized another event on his tennis court, this time calling it Community Accountability Day. The theme? How to spot corruption in your HOA. He even invited guest speakers, a local attorney specializing in HOA law and an accountant who gave tips on reading financial statements. The event was a hit. Dozens of neighbors showed up to learn how they could protect themselves from future Lindas. And by the end of the day, people were jokingly calling James the Auditor General of Suburbia. But here's my favorite part. As a final touch of poetic justice, James used some of the proceeds from his tennis court rentals. Yes, people were still paying him to play there, to install a brand new sign at the entrance to the neighborhood. It read, "Welcome to our community, home of transparency and accountability." And right underneath that, a smaller sign that said, "P.S. Don't mess with James." Linda eventually pled guilty to several charges and agreed to repay thousands of dollars in restitution. A fitting end for someone who spent years abusing her power under the guise of community service. As for James, well, he finally got what he wanted. Peace and quiet in his little corner of suburbia. His tennis court remained private property with no trespassers in sight. His neighbors respected him more than ever, and the new HOA board actually started doing its job properly, thanks in no small part to James' relentless efforts. And honestly, if there's one lesson we can all take away from this story, it's this: never underestimate an auditor with a grudge. So, after everything, the lawsuits, the audits, the federal investigation, James finally had what he wanted: peace. The HOA was running smoothly under new leadership. Linda was out of the picture, probably Googling how to survive on ramen noodles while paying restitution. And James' tennis court was once again his private sanctuary. No strangers blasting 80s rock. No unauthorized doubles matches. Just James and his racket living their best life. But here's the funny thing about peace. It's boring. And James? James wasn't built for boring. See, after months of battling Linda and her HOA shenanigans, James had developed a taste for justice, and not just in his own neighborhood. He started getting calls from people in other communities asking for advice on how to deal with their own HOA nightmares. There was Karen from 3 streets over whose HOA fined her $500 for planting non-regulation tulips. And then there was Steve from across town whose HOA tried to repossess his car because it was an eyesore. At first, James thought, Why me? I'm just a guy who wanted to play tennis in peace. But then he realized something. He was the guy who stood up to the HOA and won. He was the suburban Robin Hood, taking down corrupt board members and giving power back to the people. And honestly, he kind of liked it. So, James started hosting monthly workshops on his tennis court, because where else would he host them? He called them Know Your Rights as a Homeowner, and they quickly became the hottest ticket in town. People showed up with notebooks, pens, and horror stories about their own HOAs. James would walk them through everything, from how to read CC and RS without falling asleep to how to file complaints with the state attorney general's office. He even brought in guest speakers like lawyers and accountants to give professional advice. And let me tell you, these workshops were wild. One time, a woman stood up and said her HOA had fined her $300 for leaving her garage door open too long while unloading groceries. Another guy said his HOA banned basketball hoops because they were too urban. Too urban? What does that even mean? By the end of each workshop, people were fired up and ready to take on their HOAs like gladiators entering the arena. But James didn't stop there. He decided it was time to take his message national. He started a YouTube channel called HOA Justice League, where he shared tips, tricks, and cautionary tales about dealing with HOAs. His first video, a dramatic reenactment of his battle with Linda titled, How My Tennis Court Sparked an HOA Revolution. It featured James holding his property deed like a sword and delivering lines like, "This is my court, not your community amenity." The video went viral almost overnight. People from all over the country started commenting things like, "I wish we had a James in our neighborhood," and "Can you audit my HOA next?" Some even sent him pictures of their own ridiculous HOA violation notices, like one guy who got fined for having excessively festive Christmas lights. Excessively festive. Isn't that the whole point of Christmas? James leaned into the momentum. He started posting weekly videos covering everything from top 5 ways HOAs abuse their power to how to spot financial mismanagement in your HOA's budget. He even did a live Q&A where viewers could ask him questions about their specific situations. And let me tell you, some of those questions were wild. One woman asked if her HOA could legally ban flip-flops in common areas. Spoiler alert, they can't. Another guy wanted to know if he could sue his HOA for emotional distress after they sent him 17 violation notices in 1 month. Spoiler alert, probably not. The channel blew up. Within 6 months, James had over 100,000 subscribers and was getting sponsorship deals from companies that sold things like security cameras and legal templates for filing complaints. He used some of the money to upgrade his tennis court, new nets, fresh paint, and donated the rest to local charities because, well, he's James. But here's my favorite part. People started sending him fan mail. Actual letters thanking him for standing up to HOAs everywhere. One woman wrote that she'd been inspired by his videos to challenge her own HOA president and ended up uncovering a $10,000 embezzlement scheme. Another guy said he'd used James' tips to negotiate lower dues for his entire community. And then there was the kid who sent him a drawing of James holding a tennis racket like a superhero weapon with the caption, "HOA man saves the day." James framed that one. Now, I know what you're thinking. Does this story have a happy ending? And honestly, it does. Because at the end of the day, James didn't just win back his tennis court, he won back his community. He proved that one person can make a difference. Even if that difference starts with something as simple as saying, "No, Linda." So here's my message to all of you listening right now. If you've ever felt powerless against an overreaching HOA or any other petty bureaucracy trying to control your life, remember James. Remember that sometimes all it takes is one person standing up and saying, "Enough." And hey, if you like this story, and let's be honest, how could you not? Don't forget to like this video, Share it with your friends who've been battling their own suburban dictatorships. Leave a comment telling me your wildest HOA horror story. I love reading those. And hit that subscribe button so you never miss another tale of justice served hot. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to live our lives without someone fining us for non-regulation tulips. Thanks for listening, and remember, don't mess with James.